Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and I'm joined tonight by Helena, aka NoJustice MTG. Helena, how are you? Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. 2 days in a row. It's a turnout for the books. I am not doing too badly at all. As always, looking forward to the show. Some very interesting stuff to talk about today.
Some very interesting stuff indeed. Coming up later tonight, the Home Office has announced new immigration figures, and it's bad news for the NHS. Democratic vice presidential pick Tim Walz has appeared at the DNC, and Bisan of Gaza has been nominated for an Emmy, but not everyone's happy about it. Stay tuned for all of that. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is an expert at U-turns, abandoning one policy pledge after another as the political winds change direction. One of the central planks of his 2020 leadership election was free movement in the EU, with Starmer saying this.
I want people in this country to be able to go and work abroad in Europe. And I want people in Europe to be able to come and continue to work here. I want families to be able to live together, whether that's in Europe or here. And I want people in this country, in the United Kingdom, to be able to go and study in Europe, just as they can now, and people in Europe to be able to come and study here. We have to make the case for freedom of movement.
Earlier this year, however, Starmer was saying this.
Well, let's take free movement. That was part and parcel of our membership of the EU. We've left the EU. Freedom of movement is over. And there's no case for bringing it
You
back.
argued for it after Brexit.
I said as we were negotiating the exit from the EU. But that's done. We're out. We're not going back. And therefore, we're not having freedom of movement.
Now, a story in the Times this morning carried the suggestion that Starmer might be about to U-turn on a U-turn, kind of. Keir Starmer's plan to reset relations with the EU could involve granting 18 to 30-year-olds from EU countries visas to work, study, or volunteer in the UK. And it would come with a reciprocal agreement for young British people to do the same in the EU. Now, that report came out late on Tuesday night, and I don't really know why the Times is talking about relaxing free movement curbs, except to cause trouble, of course, because the proposal on the table is about a visa scheme. According to the Times, the proposal has come from the EU, and it's a deal that the bloc wants in return for various concessions it's prepared to make to ease the UK's post-Brexit trade problems with the continent. These include a veterinary agreement that could reduce checks on UK food entering the EU market, as well as recognition of British professional qualifications. One government source told the Times this. No one will say it publicly at this stage, but there is an acknowledgement that this is an area where we will need to move. If we are serious about resetting relations with the EU, then we need to be prepared to give them some of the things that they want. Other parts of the EU's visa proposal include allowing EU students to pay domestic fees at British universities. And while a young person from any EU state could come to the UK adults under 30 would be limited to choosing just one EU country to go to. But as with all things, the details could be up for negotiation. An EU source told the Times this. Mobility will be a key. It's not that we think Starmer will swallow the whole Commission position, which is maximalist, but we do think he will shift. It might be Erasmus, which is popular in Labour circles. But something will give. The Erasmus programme allowed for student exchanges between British universities and European ones. In 2018, nearly 10,000 British students spent between 2 months and a year at an EU university. But the scheme came to an end after the Brexit deal was signed. Now, this visa deal isn't new. It was first proposed by the EU back in April, with both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer rejecting it immediately. At the time, European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen said this. The topic of youth mobility is in both our interests, because the more we have youth mobility being on both sides of the channel, the more we increase the probability we will be on good terms because the next generation knows each other very well. Now, whatever your views on Brexit, this seems like a good idea for British young people, restoring some of the rights they once had to live abroad amongst our neighbours at least for a time. And it would bring the EU into line with other countries like Canada and Australia, which have similar reciprocal deals with us. But by lunchtime, the Labour government had quashed the rumours, with The Guardian reporting this. UK ministers have ruled out joining in a youth mobility scheme with the EU and have said the matter won't be revisited. A spokesperson for the government told the paper this: "We're not considering it. There are no plans for this or any work being done on it. Our negotiating team has very clear red lines, and none of the preparatory work involves this." So, why are Labour so keen to shut this down? After all, younger people are among Labour's most reliable voters, with over 40% of voters under 30 picking the party at the last election. Helena, what do you think's going on here? Why is a visa exchange scheme with Canada or Australia okay, but not with the EU?
Well, at the end of the day, it's going to have to come down to press headlines. That's just going to be one of the main things that Labour is scared of in trying to acquiesce with any kind of EU or any kind of change in our relationship with the European Union that might get people who did support Brexit, especially kind of heartland Labour seats in places like the Red Wall, might get them angry if it gets reported in a way that people are unhappy with in some part of the rogues gallery of right-wing press institutions in this country. Now, of course, as you say, this isn't free movement, this is just a visa scheme, but it's still going to get caught up in all of the headlines that we see about large numbers for net migration. Again, we don't have any kind of normal conversation about what might make up those figures, if these are students, people on limited time visas. No, if the number is too high, that's bad news for the government in terms of headlines. They said they want to get it down, and if they don't get it down, if they don't get it down, regardless of why it is increased or not, or why it has stayed stagnant, people will still be upset, even if it's because people are going to be here for 3 years and then they're going to leave. That's no different in terms of the net migration figures as for somebody who's staying here for a more permanent visa, for example.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I saw an article today as well saying that this was, in The Spectator, of course, saying that this was kind of undoing Brexit via the back door. And that, the real problem was if students, for example, came here, they might meet someone and stay, and then you can't get them to go. But obviously that's the same, that applies really for any kind of visa. And yeah, what you say about the headlines is totally right. It's just unbelievable how this government is so desperate to keep its lead in the polls, even though there's an election not for another 4 or 5 years, that it's willing to actually make policy or respond to those headlines in its policy making at the cost of those younger voters who voted so loyally for them in the last election. Anyway, let's move on.
Absolutely. I mean, Simon...
Sorry, go on, Helena. No, go on, Helena, sorry.
Simon Wren Lewis was actually speaking about this on Twitter, saying, well, they seem to be acting like a government or like a party who are still campaigning for an election that's next year, rather than a new government that's trying to be able to set the terms of the zeitgeist. And at the end of the day, what you say about young people being loyal, well, this is a problem. They don't seem to have any kind of desire to move to a different party. So if they're going to be taken for granted and still not move, then Labour have every reason to continue to ignore them. They also don't live in swing seats. Demographic shift in this country has concentrated young voters in very safe Labour seats, and the swing voters from older generations are more kind of evenly distributed around the country in the far more swing seats. And Labour they don't have anything to offer young people, very little in terms of things like housing, by building new council houses, for example, better working arrangements, really and truly. So I don't think unless young voters actively show they're not going to be taken for granted by Labour will continue down this line in terms of ignoring their policy interests.
The government's latest immigration figures have been released today, and they tell a troubling story about the future of the NHS and social care in Britain. The figures reveal a sharp decline in the number of people coming to the UK to work in the NHS and social care. According to the Home Office, just under 90,000 visas were approved for workers in the health and care sector in the year to June 2024. That's down 26% on the previous year. And the number of visas granted between April and June this year was 89% lower, 89% than in the same period last year. Now, that drop hasn't come because of tougher measures on granting visas. It's come because people in the healthcare sector have stopped applying to work in the UK. That's after Rishi Sunak's government put a ban on those coming to the UK on health and care visas from bringing family members with them. That ban took effect in March this year. Labour has said it has no plans to change that policy, by the way. There have also been far fewer international students applying to study in the UK, a development that's having serious effects on the finances of many British universities. In the first 6 months of last year, over 150,000 students applied to study in the UK. In the same period this year, that fell to under 95,000, a drop of 40%. Foreign students were also hit by the Tories' ban on family members. And finally, there's a drop in the number of people seeking asylum in the UK. This is from the BBC. Some 97,000 people sought refuge in the UK to June. That is 8% down on the previous year. That number includes some 38,784 irregular or clandestine arrivals, 80% of whom came in small boats across the English Channel. And small boat arrivals are also down by nearly 30% on last year, with just over 30,000 people arriving via the dangerous Channel crossing. Nonetheless, the number of people awaiting a decision on their asylum claims has grown slightly. At the end of June, there were nearly 119,000 people awaiting an asylum decision. That's up by around 500 people since the end of March. But what's really striking about this graph is how little the backlog has shifted this year. And the stagnating pace of decisions is affecting those arriving by small boat the most. Almost everyone who arrived on a small boat in the last year is still waiting for an asylum decision from the Home Office, according to Home Office figures. Marley Morris of the Institute for Public Policy Research gave The Guardian this explanation for the drop in cases processed. Despite the previous Home Secretary making progress on clearing the backlog of asylum claims last year, the backlog has barely changed in recent months as ministers were distracted by the Rwanda plan. The government has done the right thing in cancelling the Rwanda deal and unblocking asylum processing, but further reform will be necessary to bring down the backlog and close down eye-wateringly expensive asylum hotels. Helena. Now, that's one explanation, but if you were cynical, and I am cynical, so I'm going to say it, you might think that actually slowing down the processing of those claims and filling up hotels prior to the election was something that might have served the Tories' agenda. What do you think of that theory?
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you are a party who genuinely believes that the amount we would be spending on asylum hotels was a bad thing, you wouldn't necessarily be the people who would be implementing that policy. Unless, of course, you had people with links to the party who were being given contracts to run those hotels, for example. Serco was just one of the people who were given one of those contracts, and it helped an electoral purpose for them. I think backfired quite a lot, though. We saw loads of people leaving the Conservative Party voter base to go and vote for Reform UK explicitly because they failed on this very specific policy. So it didn't necessarily work in the way that they wanted to. How we deal with this problem, of course, when you have this massive queue of people who need to be seen, who need to have their cases heard by our asylum processing system, and you have a very austere government in charge at the moment who aren't willing to properly invest in new caseworkers, new people to have a look at these asylum claims, we need to be thinking about a little bit outside of the box in terms of how we deal with this large backlog. Zoe Gardner wrote an article in Byline Times just recently talking about how some of the people who do come across in small boats, especially given the countries that they come from, places like Afghanistan and Syria and Eritrea and Sudan, these people already have very, very high acceptance rates for asylum claims, much more so than a lot of other countries. I mean, it's very easy to understand why. Afghanistan and Syria have both had very, very large wars in those areas in recent times. The Taliban are in charge in Afghanistan. It's very easy to get your asylum claim processed when you're under threat from a tyrannical regime like that. So they have very high process rates. So it'd be very easy if you wanted to expedite these claims by doing background checks in terms of criminal threats, for example, without having to necessarily be by being a little more lenient in terms of how we deal with them as being asylum seekers about the level to which that they are under threat. We could be able to get these backlogs cleared by being able to get these claims expedited and wouldn't have to worry too much about accepting people who wouldn't otherwise have a reasonable claim for asylum. Second of all, when it comes to the drop in people on health and social care visas, when polled by YouGov, the majority, like a super majority of people polled by YouGov, said that they thought it was a bad thing that we had fewer people coming here specifically to work in the NHS. Again, another artifact of everybody focusing on single figures rather than different parts of the migration system, whether they work poorly or whether they don't. But unfortunately, we're not going to have to see a change on this because Keir Starmer campaigned during the election on wanting to train up British people to work in the NHS rather than relying on people for overseas. Whether you think that's bad or good, unfortunately, our unemployment rate in this country is still pretty low. It's still around about 4%. The last time we had 4% in terms of unemployment was in the 1970s. There isn't this massive group of people that we can draw upon for new labour in the NHS. So we're going to have to rely, until unemployment goes up, we're going to have to rely on people coming from overseas to work. And the public do support this. Is that ever going to be reported in earnest rather than talk about single figures that don't really make sense unless you put them in context? Unfortunately, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, the drop in the number of people applying of, what was it, nearly 90% for health and care visas is just astounding. And I guess it's going to take a little while for us to see the knock-on effect of that in the NHS, which is at this moment full of vacancies in the NHS. And of course, the care sector is desperate for people as well. Yeah, so...
Absolutely.
Well, as you say, but no change expected from Labour despite that bleak prospect. The Democratic National Convention churns on in Chicago, with Kamala Harris's vice president pick Tim Walz making his debut on the big stage. Calling the event the biggest speech of my life, Walz said this about Harris's pitch to the country.
We've got a chance to make Kamala Harris the next president of the United States. But I think we owe it to the American people to tell them exactly what she'd do as president before we ask them for their votes. So this is the part, clip and save it and send it to your undecided relatives so they know. If you're a middle-class family or a family trying to get into the middle class, Kamala Harris is going to cut your taxes. If you're getting squeezed by prescription drug prices, Kamala Harris is going to take on Big Pharma. If you're hoping to buy a home, Kamala Harris is going to help make it more affordable. And no matter who you are, Kamala Harris is going to stand up and fight for your freedom to live the life that you want to lead. Because that's what we want for ourselves, and it's what we want for our neighbors.
A pretty good speech there, I think, from Walz, and certainly had the crowd on their feet at several moments. But a very big issue in this election is reproductive health, with several speakers at the DNC giving first-hand accounts of their own experiences in states with abortion restrictions. An abortion ban is a part of the ultra-conservative Project 2025, which some have said Donald Trump and J.D. Vance support. Trump, though, has distanced himself from those proposals. But in his speech, Walz turned to a different kind of reproductive freedom.
We also protected reproductive freedom because in Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and the personal choices they make. And even if we wouldn't make those same choices for ourselves, we've got a golden rule. Mind your own damn business. And that includes IVF and fertility treatments. And this is personal for Gwen and I. If you've never experienced the hell that is infertility, I guarantee you know somebody who has. And I can remember praying each night for a phone call. The pit in your stomach when the phone had rang, and the absolute agony when we heard the treatments hadn't worked. It took Gwen and I years, but we had access to fertility treatments. And when our daughter was born, we named her Hope. Hope, Gus, and Gwen, you are my entire world, and I love you.
Look, now I know that the whole setup of these big US election events lends itself to quite sentimental manipulation, but I have to say that that clip got me right in the feels when I watched it this morning. And maybe that's because I actually have a child who wouldn't be here without fertility medicine. Maybe it's just because I have daddy issues. But then I started wondering whether Trump has actually proposed restrictions on fertility treatments. And so what did I find? Well, in February this year, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that some providers in the state needed to suspend their IVF treatments. According to the court, excess embryos created during the treatment should legally be considered children, meaning they couldn't be disposed of. At the time, Trump said this about the ruling. "We want to make it easier for mothers and fathers to have babies, not harder. That includes supporting the availability of fertility treatments like IVF in every state in America." That Alabama ruling was soon rendered void when state lawmakers passed a bill protecting IVF services. So, what's the evidence for the claim that fertility treatments are at risk? Well, it seems to be this. In June, a Democrat-backed bill to establish a national right to IVF treatments was blocked by Senate Republicans, with J.D. Vance voting with his party. Still, Trump supporters have wasted no time mocking Tim Walz's and his wife's well-documented experiences with fertility treatment. They've taken to carrying sperm cups, filled with, according to reports, a viscous white fluid and labeled J.D. Vance Full Family Kit. I'm very sorry if you're having your dinner. Helena, what did you make of Walz's speech? And what do you think about this fertility treatment, the idea that there's a threat to fertility treatments in the US? I couldn't find very much to back it up, but maybe you know more.
I don't certainly seem to have any more information than you do on this in particular, but I think that regardless of whether or not Tim Walz is particularly trying to make this a kind of grand claim about the Republicans attacking the rights to IVF, I think just using his own personal story as a way of being able to get himself ingratiated to voters, I think this makes sense from a political perspective. American politics has been pretty used at this point to wild claims with no basis in fact, and whatever you can use in your arsenal to try and win a potential election. I can understand why the Democrats are doing it at this point in time. With regards to Tim Walz's speech and how he's affected the Democratic Party ticket over the last however many weeks now, he's probably the best campaigner I think I've seen for the Democratic Party in a very, very long time. In terms of appealing to swing voters very specifically, he has everything that people who think about kind of the red-blooded American would actually kind of, they would vibe with. Of course, personally, he is somebody who's a very big family man. Family politics is really important in America. It's always been this kind of aspirational part of the American dream, quote unquote, being able to afford to own your house and raise a family in America. And he's kind of symbolic of that. He's somebody who's done public service, both within his role in the National Guard, somebody who's been a football coach and as well as a teacher. He's definitely someone who would be the kind of quintessential American father in that regard. So in terms of the kind of people that he appeals to, he certainly fulfills a niche that most people in the Democratic Party wouldn't otherwise fill. When it comes to policy, in terms of his time as governor of Minnesota, he's been incredibly progressive in some of the things that he's passed. We've covered this before, and I won't go over them now, but his record is certainly very strong in terms of the kind of policy that he supports. And in terms of how he's campaigned, he is the progenitor of these attacks on the Trump campaign and Republicans in general as being weird. Now, nothing is weirder than carrying around pots of what is essentially your vice presidential candidate's like theoretical semen around you to use as some kind of joke. That's pretty weird. That's pretty weird. And for far too long, we mentioned on the show yesterday, Michelle Obama's, well, when they go low, we go high, has been part of the Democrats' repertoire. Did that work? Did it fuck? That didn't work. Be nasty to these people. The Republicans are weird. They're incredibly weird. They're obsessed with niche cultural issues that do not affect everyday Americans. You saw what happened to the Conservative Party in the UK, campaigning about gender-neutral bathrooms and people talk about critical race theory. People are not interested in this. They're interested in how the economy is working, the state of the public finances, and ensuring public services work. Tim Walz has all of the policy backing on making sure that these things work in the interest of ordinary people in Minnesota. So running on these specifically as an antidote to the tired and hackneyed and quite frankly laughable cultural politics of the Republican weirdos is certainly a strong tactic coming up to the election.
I mean, I'm just surprised it took so long for someone to say the word weird. I mean, it was like sort of presented as this like amazing exercise in marketing that he came up with. Actually, like, why had no one said it before? But I wanted to just go back to this fertility treatments issue, if it is an issue. I mean, obviously, abortion is under threat in America. Women's right to choose their own reproductive futures is under threat. But I wondered why the fertility treatment, why that wasn't enough to generate kind of the genuine anxiety that should be generated amongst Democratic voters and independent voters and so on, and why this fertility treatment story has come up. I mean, obviously there is a relationship, as we saw in the Alabama court ruling, between how IVF is done and, you know, the idea of there being excess embryos that, you know, aren't going to be taken to term. But I also wondered if it's, because it's not just Waltz who said it. Kamala Harris has herself actually talked about this and tweeted about it. And I wonder if there's something here about like covering up what still remains a bit of a vacuum when it comes to policy from Harris. So generating something that everyone can gather around, which isn't scrutiny of a policy platform.
I can understand that potentially. I think that in terms of rhetoric, though, if you focus too much of your politics in terms of being access to reproductive healthcare and being essentially being seen by a lot of people as being the pro-abortion party, we've spoken a lot. I mean, Aaron's spoken a lot on Novara about dropping in birth rates around the world and wanting there to be a pro-natalist left-wing movement. So having something that you can use as a foil to your abortion politics is, I think, very important in how you run a left-wing campaign, or at least a liberal campaign in the kind of a post-2020 world, where you need to say, well, actually, we do want to have people access to be able to have their own families. We should be encouraging people to have families in the future, rather than just being thinking, well, we're the people we don't care about families at all. But whether or not you want to have your personal choices, whether it be to not have a family or to have a family, they can market themselves as being the party that backs you in those choices, which again, that is supposed to be, as far as what they are concerned with, is this juxtaposition next to a Republican Party that wants to take away your choices, to take away your quote-unquote freedoms. Of course, the pro-freedom narrative has been something that American political parties have tried to attach themselves to rhetorically, for centuries at this point. They're supposed to be the country of freedom. And whereas the Republicans have been able to run on that ticket as being the Freedom Party. We won't take away your guns. We won't be the ones who tax you. By trying to reframe that narrative and say, well, the Republicans are the ones who definitely want to take your abortion, and we're going to have this kind of this pretty spurious accusation that they want to take away your IVF outside of one kind of very kind of niche court ruling in Alabama. At least it shows them trying to rhetorically shift where they're coming from. And also, as you say, it's probably on top of the fact that in terms of policy, they do need to find something more than what they have currently. Because when you've already an incumbent, you can't just run on the last 4 years. You have to try and up the ante from there. And so far, as you say, they've not really pushed the boat out in terms of a very kind of strong part of the economic platform, especially not on something really important like healthcare, where we really have a dearth of propositions to solve the healthcare crisis in the United States that we're seeing right now. So refocusing that just on reproductive healthcare might win over like suburban women, that kind of swing voting demographic, but they need to have more that's going to approach where they're going to win swing voters over in the Rust Belt too.
Yeah, totally. And I'm wondering if we'll hear some of those from Harris in her speech at the DNC later tonight. She's also promised to give her first long-form interview to some media outlet by, I think, the end of this month, which is only just over a week away. Let's see what that holds. Now, back to the DNC, there were some other big hitters out on the Democratic stage last night. This was former President Bill Clinton.
We've seen more than one election slip away from us when we thought it couldn't happen, when people got distracted by phony issues or overconfident. This is a brutal, tough business. I want you to be happy. One of the reasons that President-to-be Harris is doing so well is that we're all so happy. But you should never underestimate your adversary. And these people are really good at distracting us, at triggering doubt, at triggering buyer's remorse. As the Obama said so eloquently last night, they are human, you know. They're bound to make a mistake now and then. We got to be tough.
Wasn't sure it was a totally coherent speech from Clinton there. But there was another appearance, and this one was a surprise appearance from someone just as famous as any US president. Oprah Winfrey gave a speech in which she talked about Tessie Prevost Williams, a 6-year-old black girl from New Orleans who integrated an all-white school in 1960. She then said this about Kamala Harris.
But it was the grace and guts and courage of women like Tessie Prevost Williams that paved the way for another young girl who 9 years later became part of the second class to integrate the public schools in Berkeley, California. And it seems to me that at school and at home, somebody did a beautiful job of showing this young girl how to challenge the people at the top and empower the people at the bottom. They showed her how to look at the world and see not just what is, but what can be. They instilled in her a passion for justice and freedom and the glorious fighting spirit necessary to pursue that passion. And soon, and very soon, very soon, we're going to be teaching our daughters and sons about how this child of an Indian mother and a Jamaican father, two idealistic, energetic immigrants, how this child grew up to become the 47th president of the United States.
Helena, we touched on this a little bit last night when we were talking about the DNC, this kind of like mythology building that goes on at these sorts of events. And you saw an excellent example of it there with Oprah connecting Kamala Harris to historical events of school desegregation. But what I wanted to ask you about is well, first of all, how that myth making works, but also, I meant to say as well, there's an important reason why Oprah was there, because she's actually a registered independent. So she's there to speak to the independents in the country. But yeah, what I wanted to ask you about is like, how is it that the Americans kind of do this so well? I find myself getting really swept up in it, even despite myself. Like all my critical faculties start to kind of shut down. Whereas if we had someone, I mean, there's no equivalent to Oprah in the UK, but if you imagine someone like that being hauled out to, stump for Keir Starmer, it would just be like totally cringe. How is it that it somehow works in this setting?
I think it is very strange how it works. Oprah is like universally liked across the United States as well, outside of some sectors. She's a really popular figure. And as you say, registered independent means that she's got lots of sway in a way that many people don't. I mean, you look at the kind of, making the comparison over to the UK as well. There's this video that lives in my head rent-free of Tony Robinson waving his arms around and telling people to vote Labour. And it's just the most cringe thing you've ever seen in your life. It is an absolute, like a weapons grade cringe content. And you have this comparison, it's just night and day. This kind of polemic speech that Oprah is giving people about how this potential landmark moment in American history could come about. And do we have anything at all that potentially cuts across like in the UK? We've got nothing. We have nothing in the sense. It is interesting to see Oprah juxtaposed as well against somebody like Bill Clinton, somebody who actually, we talked on yesterday's show about the veneration of historic presidents of the United States. So one person who seems to not have that same appeal is certainly Bill Clinton. You definitely, when you look at the kind of scandals that he was in, not just in his terms of his time in office, but then afterwards as well, it really does leave a sour taste in terms of how people view him. And he's part of a political dynasty too. Having him up on stage, I think, is actually really bad optics for the party when, for the first time, I actually mentioned this speaking about the US politics with Aaron previously too, one of the things that Trump ran on previously was this idea of being the iconoclast, being the outsider running against political dynasties, of which the Clintons are one of the biggest political dynasties in America. Bring him on stage to ramble incoherently, which is what that sounded like to me. That's not a good look. That puts off people who could be swayed by a populist message, rather than there being these insurgent new actors in this, in terms of Waltz and Harris, in terms of Democratic Party politics, certainly. Now, that is taking what they do have there and kind of undermining it by having Clinton on the stage. But Oprah as a political figure, again, I mean, she kind of symbolizes the ability of anybody to make it, and for people who do, to be widely loved by the population as well. And so having that backing is very strong for the Democratic Party. Do we have this mythologizing of like the British dream and the way that Americans have the American dream and the people who succeed from that? And in the UK, we're far more cynical, especially for those who are successful, regardless of whether or not that we perceive that success to be warranted or not. And that's a very large cultural distinction that I can't really put my finger on.
Yeah, me neither. But you're right about Oprah being the kind of personification of the American dream, making it all the way from Chicago, as a youngster to, a billionaire, multinational brand. Kind of wild.
Hi everyone, this is Bisan from Gaza. I'm still alive.
That was the very familiar face of Bisan of Gaza. She's the young Palestinian journalist whose social media dispatches from Gaza under bombardment opened a global window onto the suffering of those living in the enclave over the last 10 months. Now, that clip is from a short Al Jazeera documentary called It's Bisan from Gaza and I'm Still Alive, which catalogues some of Bisan Atef Auda's journalism. This is a clip from that film.
In November 2023, I was among hundreds of thousands forced to risk our lives by walking south on Salah ad-Din Street, and I ended up in Khan Yunis.
Hi everyone, this is Bisan. We are from the last people that evacuated the north of Gaza. Thousands are walking. You have to walk for 3 to 4 hours. Many places are bombed.
Some people take an initiative to distribute water and biscuits for people.
Hundreds of thousands of people are in tents. They don't have any place to go or in the streets.
Now, that documentary was awarded a prestigious Peabody Award for Excellent Journalism earlier this year. And in July, it was nominated for an Emmy Award in the category Outstanding Hard News Feature Story Short Form. But not everyone was happy about it being recognized by the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. This is from a write-up in film industry paper, The Wrap. A pro-Israel non-profit called the Creative Community for Peace, or CCFP, wrote a letter to the Academy calling on it to rescind Bisan's nomination over her alleged ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The Wrap goes on to say this. CCFP, a pro-Israel non-profit organization, discovered Auda's long-standing ties to PFLP, which has been a designated terrorist organization in the US since 1997. The journalist regularly spoke at PFLP rallies and hosted events to honor Palestinians injured or killed in violent confrontations with Israeli soldiers. In 2018, the PFLP explicitly referred to Auda as a member of the Progressive Youth Union of the organization. And CCFP director Ari Engel told The Wrap this. The Emmy's decision to honor someone with clear ties to a US-designated terrorist group is inexcusable and should have never happened. It would be legitimizing a terrorist organization. If the Emmys don't change course and rescind this nomination, they will be glorifying someone who is a member of an organization that has carried out numerous aircraft hijackings, participated in the October 7 massacre in Israel, carried out waves of bombings on markets and restaurants, and murdered innocent women and children. The Emmys cannot allow their prestigious award show to be hijacked by terrorists and instead should continue to promote peace and tolerance through the arts. And Engel went on to say this. The entertainment community, including the National Television Academy, should use its voice to help build bridges for peace and understanding. However, the Emmy nomination of Bisan Auda, someone with documented terrorism ties, is unfathomably irresponsible. With it, the Academy is condoning violence and helping to normalize PFLP terrorism around the globe. Now, more than 150 people signed that letter, including Will and Grace star Deborah Messing and former CEO of Paramount Pictures Sherry Lansing. Now, look, we can't verify those supposed links, but what we do know is that the PFLP, a revolutionary socialist group, has at times been opposed to both the Hamas government in Gaza as well as the more moderate Fatah party. Its members have included Palestinian liberation icon Leila Khaled, and yes, the group has committed acts in breach of international law, including attacks on civilians. Now, the Academy has responded to the letter from the CCFP with its president, Adam Sharp, saying this. The news and documentaries Emmys have recognized excellence in television journalism for nearly half a century. The honored programs and reports have taken viewers to the front lines of every world conflict, probed political and cultural divides, and sought to illuminate even the darkest circumstances. Some of these works have been controversial, giving a platform to voices that certain viewers may find objectionable or even abhorrent, but all have been in the service of the journalistic mission to capture every facet of the story. NATAS is aware of reports cited in your letter and initially surfaced by a communications consultant in the region that appear to show a then teenage Bisan Auda speaking at various PFLP-associated events between 6 and 9 years ago. NATAS has been unable to corroborate these reports, nor has it been able to date to surface any evidence of more contemporary or active involvement by Auda with a PFLP organization. The Academy also, in that letter, rejected the request from the CCFP, meaning Bisan and Al Jazeera are still in contention for the prestigious TV award. Helena, Bisan's journalism has opened a lot of people's eyes to what's happening in Gaza. It's been incredibly important in many ways. So what do you make of this story?
I mean, there's a large level of hypocrisy here as well, where, of course, as you said, there have been plenty of attacks that the PFLP have done historically. There have been violations of international law. The IDF, they violate international law all of the time. Do you think there would have been the same reaction if somebody else had previously who'd served in the IDF was being given an award somewhere else? Do we ever see anyone being removed from a potential category for any kind of award show off and being acknowledged in terms of the things that they do for the arts? Do we ever have these people, their awards rescinded because they have previously served in the IDF? Of course we don't. Of course we don't. And even then, like, she has been speaking at rallies. She allegedly has links to a social movement that has links to the PFLP. Has she ever been a member of the Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades? No, they have no evidence for these things. Again, we've got to separate the fact that the PFLP are a political organization and the Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades are their military wing, who are the ones who have previously engaged in violations of international law, some terror attacks as well on Israeli soil, for example. But the last claimed terror attack by the Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades was in 2015 anyway, before any of these claims about Bisan were even talked about. One point that they made in the letter too was saying, oh, well, this is a group that was involved in the October the 7th massacre in Israel. And well, whilst again there were plenty of violations of international law and war crimes that were committed by the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades and the Al-Quds brigades on October the 7th, there's been no evidence, at least not that I could find, that there were any terror attacks or any violations of international law committed by the PFLP's Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, specifically on October the 7th. Even NGO Monitor, a pro-Israel front group that is used to smear anti-Zionist groups, even NGO Monitor couldn't provide any evidence at all that the PFLP did anything that was targeted at civilians, specifically, let's say, on October the 7th. They have plenty of videos of the PFLP's militant wing attacking military targets, but that is, of course, a legitimate target for people attacking an occupying force under international law. And if that's all the NGO Monitor has, like, again, a pro-Zionist group used to smear anti-Zionist groups, then that's not really particularly good evidence now, is it, that they participated in October the 7th massacres? Because there's no evidence has been provided, at least not that I could find, in terms of this. So using this pretty weak this pretty weak evidence to be able to remove Bisan's incredibly important journalism from such prestigious awards, it strikes to me like that it's desperation to ensure that we do not actually have proper credit being given to somebody who's done a lot of good work to expose the failure of American foreign relations with Israel at a time where this should be being put under as much scrutiny as possible. And it seems like some people want the hands to be washed of this rather than for everybody to see this in the open, and have the people who have exposed it rewarded, at least given recognition for the hard work that they have done in exposing America and Israel's crimes.
Yeah, I mean, even if Bisan did have some of those links, I'm not suggesting for a moment that she did. She's not filming from film sets of blown up buildings in the background, or made up places with tents. She's doing, as you say, incredibly important journalism. And one of the very, very important ways in which her journalism works is that it's this kind of a very different style of journalism from the kind of sanitized corporate journalism where objectivity is what's valued most. I mean, it's quite bogus notion. It's this sort of, immersion journalism where she is in the scene and she's reporting it as someone in the scene, a Palestinian. And it's a way in which she's been able to build incredibly powerful parasocial relations with viewers. People feel like they know her, they're concerned about her. When she goes quiet for a while on social media, people are really, really worried, as they should be, because journalists are being killed all the time in Gaza by the IDF. So I wonder if there's also something here about the power and this kind of shockingness of this kind of journalism to a Western audience, a young Western audience in particular, that certain groups, pro-Israeli groups, would like to have silenced or not taken to a larger audience.
Well, absolutely. Citizen journalism is something it is something very novel in the social media age. People being able to do direct reporting on the ground from things which were previously the reserve of far more established groups before now. The advent of the camera phone led to this whole thing where we had camera phone journalism going on, and now this has become something that has been it's been professionalized somewhat. That's to be true. But regardless of whether or not it's been professionalized elsewhere, Bisan has done incredibly important work in being somebody who has been on the ground, especially whilst we have seen this difference between citizen journalists being able to give us the inside story without any kind of filter on what gets reported, which we do have. You got to remember, when journalists come in for TV reporting crews outside, they have to be accompanied by the IDF, and they have to have their footage screened as to what we can see when Israel allowed people into Gaza to report what's going on in the war. It's incredibly important that we have citizen journalists on the ground being able to report these things, as you say, this kind of immersion journalism. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know the full extent of what was going on, because everything else has been sanitized to the point of being essentially irrelevant when it comes to what the IDF will allow people to see and what they won't. So that is a really important distinction that we have going on there, which is incredibly important. That, there is as well this emotional connection that you have to somebody who is being the person whose life could be ended at any moment. As you say, we have seen so many journalists killed, and I can think of nothing more important in the wake of what we've seen to journalists in Gaza than giving an award to somebody who's put their own life at risk to do this reporting, knowing that journalists have been specifically targeted by the IDF during this war very specifically. So having that taken away, I think it's a real slap in the face to the work of journalists everywhere. For somebody who does so much work to put their life on the line to report this stuff, would potentially have an award taken away from them.
Her journalism is also, of course, incredibly humanizing of Palestinians in Gaza, bucking the trend of the Western media to dehumanize them or not mention how they've died or who's killed them. But I remember when the poet and professor Rafat Alaria was killed, and we did a piece on cultural genocide, and we used one of Bisan's clips where she was talking about what the destruction of the Palestinian Central Archive by the IDF meant to her and to other Palestinians. The complete erasure, not only of human beings from the strip rather, but a whole history, records of those who have already gone. And there were also, great videos of her talking about the love of cats in Palestine, how cats are loved in Palestine. So this kind of humanizing force is I think also something that people who are supporting Israel or who support this attack on Gaza find quite worrying. Helena, thank you so much for joining me tonight. You've been great.
An absolute pleasure, as always. Hope everyone's having a great evening.
Yeah, you too. And thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. This show will be back tomorrow. But for now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.